Well, when I started at Dashdot, I just thought you're going to have to buy a property, sit on it for a while. You might get 7% growth here and there, but getting 30% growth in the first year, that was something I didn't believe was possible. And then going from that 30% growth and buying another property within 12 months just seemed unheard of. So that was a massive paradigm shift.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to Dashdot Insider, the auditory epicenter for passionate property investors seeking a life of freedom, choice, and abundance. I'm your host, Emil Pinder, and joining me today is a very special guest, one of the most popular and well-regarded members of our team at Dashdot. I'm talking to Frank Sorbello. How's it going, Frank?
Emil, good. I'm a bit chilly, but other than that, having a good time. How are you?
I'm well. I envy the cold at the moment in Tokyo. Right now, it's about 32 degrees, so... Yeah. I envy the cold a little bit. All right, let's get stuck into the property side of things. Now, the reason so many people have said, get Frank on the podcast is because, and you've given me permission to disclose your age, you are 26 years old. You've been working at Dashdot for a while now, and so you've accumulated a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, right? Especially for someone who is, and I don't mean this condescendingly, but only 26. You've managed to build up quite an enviable property portfolio just in the last 2.5 years. So how many properties do you have at the moment?
I've got 2.
Okay. And what's the future looking like? How soon are you looking to get into the next one?
Good question. I've got pre-approval for number 3 now, so it should be within the next month.
Okay, so within the next month, we can confidently say Frank Sorbello is going to have a property portfolio with about 3 properties in it. Okay, can we go back to the beginning of how your property journey started? How long ago was that first one, and what was that kind of experience like? So I think this is really, really insightful for people.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, first one was about 2.5 years ago. I definitely was a bit scared, to be honest. It was pretty frightening, to be really transparent. Getting started with the first one, knowing where to buy, what to buy, the timing. There was a lot of, and even now there's a lot of info out there, so knowing who to trust, it was a bit overwhelming, which I feel like a lot of us probably go through with the first property. You probably have the same sort of thing.
Yeah, in my experience, and pretty much everyone we talk to, the first one is the most difficult. And it's usually not because of anything specific to do with the capital and cash flow that you need in order to get the property. It's the anxiety and the fear around that first one. Am I doing the right thing here? If you're buying, and this is why I think we see so many people make what could potentially be a mistake of buying their principal place of residence first. And we can talk about reinvesting a little bit later in the podcast, but when you buy your principal place of residence first, it feels like it's a comfortable thing to do. It's what everybody does. It's not a huge risk. You're buying somewhere to live in. It's a normal thing to do. Buying your first investment property, whether or not you have a principal place of residence or not, buying that first investment property feels like emotionally it's a different thing. It's not like, oh yeah, here's the bathroom, here's the kitchen, here's the bedroom, this is the layout, oh, this is what it's going to be like to have friends over and that kind of thing. It's like, okay, I'm trying to create wealth for myself and there's risk involved. And that kind of, I think, creates a lot of hesitation for people. In your experience, what was your knowledge level, if we're to say that at the moment you're maxed out, you know as much as Frank Sorbello can know, right? If right now is 100% of what you know at the moment, what kind of level were you at when you were going into that first property in terms of knowledge and experience in property investing and understanding everything?
That is a good question. I was probably only at about maybe 20% in hindsight, looking back. And I thought that I had known a fair bit more, and I did all the research and dug into all the numbers, but really looking back, I definitely didn't know what I didn't know.
Right. Okay. So with that knowledge, did things change with the second property? And when did you get into the second property?
Good question. Yeah, things shifted dramatically with the second property. So with it came a lot more confidence, just going through the first one and understanding what things were going to feel like holding property. But then beginning at Dashdot and having a lot of my beliefs challenged, going into the second one, it was more about acquiring as many good quality assets as possible in a short period of time. So just spreading my capital where I could, just so I could get in the short term. Does that answer your question?
It does. I want to go a little bit deeper though. I'm interested in what beliefs were challenged.
Good question. Well, when I started at Dashdot, I just thought you're going to have to buy a property, sit on it for a while. You might get 7% growth here and there, but getting 30% growth in the first year, that was something I didn't believe was possible. And then going from that 30% growth and buying another property within 12 months just seemed unheard of. So that was a massive paradigm shift.
Okay, so let me get this right. That first property experienced 30% growth.
Yeah.
And what sort of time frame did it take for it to get the 30% growth?
That was in the first 12 months. So I definitely got in at a bit of a discount, but the growth was pretty much straight away.
Okay, so that first property, you get 30% growth. That's allowed you to move into the second property. That second property is one that was with Dashdot?
Correct. So I just started at Dashdot. That one's up around Rocky.
Okay. How would you compare the experience when you're getting that first property versus getting the second property? What was different?
Oh man, so much. The first one, I thought I'd done all the research and dug into all the data and spoke to enough people. But at the end of the day, I'd taken on these hundreds of thousands in debt, and I was left with this property that I had no idea if it was going to perform or not. The second property, going through Dashdot and just understanding the level of research necessary and seeing this predictive model that we've got, so knowing where it's going to be in 12 months, gave me a massive just element of peace of mind, just knowing this is the right property, and me holding all this debt, it's a good thing. This property is not going to plummet in value. So worlds apart, the experiences were very different.
Okay. I think part of that may well be, although, I'm not you, I didn't feel exactly what you felt as you were doing it. Part of it is like the first one is the big scary one. And this is, I think, what a lot of people who might be in a similar situation as yourself, mid-20s, decent income, trying to work out, okay, what's the smart move? And there is this fear of like, well, should I be buying an investment property? This was an investment property that you bought first, right? It wasn't the principal place of residence.
Correct. Yeah. So I don't own a principal place of residence.
Okay. So a lot of people who might be sort of mid-20s, they're looking at property prices getting more expensive. And then there's sort of like, well, should I be buying an investment property first up? And there's a lot of fear that obviously goes around that. What for you was like, was there a light bulb moment or something that at some point convinced you that property was the way to go?
Yeah, definitely. It probably wasn't really a light bulb moment. It was more of a process of elimination. I remember in my teens, I was big into all the get rich quick schemes, like the drop shipping. I started a clothing label, just a whole heap of random shit. I was selling stuff on eBay, and none of it worked. And my parents, they owned properties.
You started a clothing label?
Yeah, I had a clothing label called Sorb's Tees and Tanks. It's still on Instagram. And I made a little bit of cash, but not enough to,
awesome.
Warrant that. But yeah, I'd seen property. My parents owned property. They spoke about it. And the more that I dug into it, it just made the most sense. It just made sense that the numbers would have worked out in the future. So that was really the main thing. Then I started reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, and that's where just everything clicked.
Okay. That's an iconic book, isn't it? Was there anything specific that he said in the book that made you think, okay, now I get it, now I understand?
I think he was discussing how people usually they fund their lifestyle from their income, and there's a few steps that are sort of skipped in that could have been refined. And he was saying you should basically use your income to invest in assets and then use the income from the assets to fund your lifestyle. And that just makes entire sense to me.
So don't use your salary to fund your lifestyle. Use your salary, use your income to fund the purchase of assets, and then use the assets to fund your lifestyle. It's been a long time since I've read that book, and rather ashamedly, I think I'd forgotten that very important tidbit, but it makes perfect sense, right? And I think we're seeing it more and more these days, particularly with people in their mid-20s or even early 30s now starting to go, if I want to make it, I can't keep on just spending my salary or my wage every month. I've got to put some away for a rainy day, but you can't just save it. Maybe a few generations ago they could, but now it's like, okay, now I've got to be thinking about asset allocation and that sort of thing. All right. Now, let's get back to the results that you've achieved, because these are phenomenal. You bought that first property 2.5 years ago, and then you said a year later, roughly, it had gone up 30%, and that was able to fund a second property. And now 18 months after that, through, I guess, consolidation, you're on the cusp of buying a third property. How far down the line are you with that third property? Are you looking at eyeballing anything specific yet?
No, don't have my eyes on any specific properties. Pre-approval's locked in. The team is on the hunt, so it should be within the next month. I've basically just said to the team, I trust you. See what you can find.
Okay. And so if we're to look at what result you're likely to get with that property, what size portfolio would you have, assuming that you end up purchasing at or very close to your borrowing capacity? You're looking to purchase right up to your borrowing capacity, or pretty close?
Pretty close, yeah, correct. So right now, the most recent vows of the first two came back at about 970 across the two of them. So if I max out the 400, it'll be, call it, say 1.4.
Okay, about 1.4. Decent amount of equity in there?
Not a massive amount of equity. It's probably only a few hundred in equity, just because I leveraged quite hard on the way in.
Okay, tell us about that, the leveraging quite hard on the way in.
Yeah, so the first property I was really scrimping and saving. I think I was only on about a 45, 50K salary. So I was budgeting pretty hard, and I had about 45K savings and worked out a 5% deposit. I think it was through Resimac, the lender. And then that allowed me to get in without having to spend another couple of years saving. So that was only a 5% deposit. The second one was a 3% deposit through LMI. And then this third one, again, is going to be another 4% deposit through ANZ.
Those are very, very small deposits. And yet with those very small deposits, just over the course of the last 2.5 years, the equity that you've built up could be like 200,000 or 300,000 you mentioned. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's very impressive. Now, those deposit amounts, 3-4%, was that a special deal, or is that something that's generally available to the public if you go to the right lender, or if you work with a mortgage broker? We've got Callum Rhodes, who was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. Fantastic guy, super smart. Recommend everyone have a chat to him, because he really knows what he's doing. He can find those little angles, but are we finding a lot of people can get? I mean, most people, if you talk to them, they're thinking, "Oh yeah, I need 20% so I can avoid LMI and things like that." What are you seeing sort of on the ground as one of our advisors?
Yeah, definitely. Anyone can get. Most people, as long as you're earning a reasonable wage and you don't have a crazy amount of personal debt, most people can get access to these kind of deals. Like you said, you've just got to go to a good broker. And this is something I'm super passionate about, that really anyone can do this. And it's unlikely you need what you think you need, the 20% deposit plus stamps to get in.
Okay, I'm sort of putting the pieces together and trying to see what the overall Frank Sorbello property journey picture looks like. And so far, and this is where I'd love you to correct me if I'm wrong, we have someone who's sort of early 20s, decides to get into property because, the background, family's into property. Rich Dad, Poor Dad is an amazing book because it's able to articulate such common sense principles in such a simple way without kind of trying to confuse everyone with all of the rubbish. And so you're experiencing a lot of anxiety. You've got a little bit of a savings deposit, and you jump into that first property. After that first property, you get some pretty awesome growth, and you start working with Dashdot, learn sort of 5 times more than you knew before about property, jump into the second property, and that feels like it wasn't a risk. That's the one that felt like, yep, this is awesome, sweet, boom. And now, only 18 months later, you're getting into the third property. That's 3 properties in 2.5 years, which sounds amazing. And you've been doing this by really leveraging the bank's money and trying to put as little money in as possible at the beginning. Was that about right?
Yeah, that's about right. That's another thing I think Kiyosaki's big on, using other people's money.
Right. Now, in the back of my mind, I'm also thinking no principal place of residence. In order to be able to really accelerate and push this property journey pretty hard, have you had to make any personal sacrifices?
Yeah, that one is a big one. So not buying a principal place of residence. It was tempting, and I'd love to, have a place to call my own, but that would have just use up all of my cash, all my borrowing capacity, all my savings per week would be going towards the repayments. So that was a sacrifice. Also, not renting, to be honest. I'd love to, rent, but I decided to stay at home. I still live with my parents, so pushed that out for another couple of years, which I'm blessed to be able to do. But that's really meant I've been able to, get started, which is a massive thing. Obviously, on top of that, no, car loans or anything like that. But I'd say they're the main things, the main sacrifices.
Okay. So keeping personal debt very, very low, not running out, buying plasma screen TVs on credit cards, not buying a Holden just for the bragging rights of having a pretty awesome car. If you think Holden's an awesome car. But instead, it sounds like a fair bit of delayed gratification has gone into this.
Yeah, that's a big one. Definitely delayed gratification, because it is going to be, at some point in time, could be 5 years, 10 years, where it's all going to, come out in the wash, and I'll be sitting on the passive income. But right now, those small few sacrifices, it makes sense for me to, cop that now, and then in a few years' time, it'll all wash out.
Well, just doing some back of the envelope calculations, thinking about your portfolio, if it's 1.3, 1.4, you said 1.4 before, let's work off of that. And the debt on it sounds like it's manageable, comfortable. You might be paying a little bit out per month, but not a huge amount. But in one double cycle, now, how long is it going to take for property prices to double at the moment? Property always feels expensive whenever you're buying it. And so historically, it seems to double every 7 to 10 years. And when you say that to people, often these days people say, but they're so expensive at the moment, it can't keep doing that forever. And then it does. So let's say if it's 7 or 8 years from now, 7 years, you'd be 33, property portfolio at 2.8, and the debt on it probably about 1.1, right? So you could be 1.7 mil in equity in one double cycle. And there's a little bit of feeding that you have to do along the way, but that's kind of the goal. That's what you're looking at as a result of the sacrifices you're making at the moment.
Definitely. Yeah, that's the goal. And when you put it like that and you lay it out like that, it just sounds so simple. And I think that's a big hurdle. Getting started, you think, how am I going to ever, possibly retire off this? It's going to be the hardest thing possible. And it's definitely not easy, but it is to some extent, as long as you have, experienced people around you that have already done what you want to do, it is reasonably simple. It's not, the craziest, most impossible thing.
Okay. I want to ask you, after that first property, and you had sort of like a certain amount of knowledge around property after that first property, and then as you've been working at Dashdot, and now you sort of have a clearer path, I guess you could say, what are the biggest mindset shifts or kind of, how would I say it? What are the biggest mindset shifts that you've had around property investing, and what are some of the things you used to believe that you no longer believe, and that sort of thing?
That's a good one. There's been some big ones. Biggest one would be, I guess, what is possible. Like I said, understanding it is possible to, retire from property in, say, 10 years. Originally, I would not have believed that. And I think it's off the back of the growth that Dashdot get. When I started, like I said, I thought 7% was good. And then seeing, 30% being possible in 12 months, that was a big, big shift. But then the other thing being with Dashdot is, because we are so different, we've got obviously this very data-focused approach. It's not the average approach to property investing at all. And I'd say that's a good thing. It's something that you need to lean on. Obviously, going down the usual pathways and doing things the average way, it's more likely just going to get you the average result. And the average Aussie gets stuck at 2 properties, as Goose mentions very often. So I think shifting away from the average, doing things differently, breaking the mold, it's been a big paradigm shift for me. And just understanding that, doing things that aren't the average way, you're going to get results that aren't average, that are way beyond average. Yeah, I'm curious, Emil. I know you've been here for a little while at Dashdot. What are your biggest mindset shifts?
The biggest mindset shift for me, I would say, is around the finance piece. I've had quite a few. My background, I've been working in property with property developers and property marketing and people in finance, doing a lot of marketing for people in the property space since about 2008. So about 16 years. I've done my own property development. And so I felt like with that sort of experience, I felt like I knew a hell of a lot. And then I come along to Dashdot and it was like, hang on, what about this? What about that? It's like, shit, well, no, that's not true because of X. And it's like, well, actually, here's some data. Here are some data. Take a look at those. And that was kind of like, yeah, okay, trust the data. Preconceived biases may have helped me in the past, but data can help me a lot more now. That's an important one. Around the finance piece, I had never really considered the order in which to purchase properties. So when I'm talking about the finance, ultimately, as you said before, you want to be using other people's money, as Robert Kiyosaki says in Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And so you want to be leveraging as much of the bank's money as possible. The bank have lending criteria. We all know this. But if you want to buy a property now and then a property in a year and then a property in a year and then a property in a year, your situation in a year needs to match what the bank will lend to. And then a year after that, it needs to match again. And so the theory of constraints has been a real revelation for me. And the theory of constraints is that you've got capital, cash flow, and credit. Credit is largely taken care of by the first two, but you need to make sure you've got the right amount of cash flow and the right amount of credit for the bank to lend a lot of money to you. And so I never thought about that before. I thought buy property, good growth location, and then it'll grow. You pull the equity out, and then you can go again. But the bank might say, okay, yeah, you had the growth, that's great, but your cash flow situation's not good enough. Or it could be the opposite, right? A lot of people, API magazine, when it was in print, and it was always like the top 5 or the top 10 cash flow locations in all of Australia. And, well, okay, you could go and you could buy somewhere for cash flow, but there may not necessarily be the growth that you need. So you might have all of this cash flow, but then if you don't have equity growth, then you have to save up for your deposit again. So that working out how to forecast that, I think Dashdot does really well. And I know we've got the suburb selection dashboard and the AI that goes in and helps us find the best suburbs in Australia for growth, but or for cash flow, whatever it is that you need. But for me, the most important revelation was actually the type of property that you need depends on your situation and where you're going to be in 2 or 3 years. That for me was like, boom, that was huge. The second thing was the units versus houses thing. Units, I'd always been anti units, right? Unless I was building them, then they're okay. If I was building them, units are fantastic. Yep, that's great. Profit for me. Thank you. But as an investor, I was never that keen on them because I had this pre-existing bias that not enough land content. Land appreciates, the building depreciates. So buy detached dwellings because you're going to get more land. And then you look at the data and there are actually big patches of like 5 years, 10 years, when you graph the growth of units versus detached dwellings, houses, you actually see that there are like these big intervals of like 5-10 years where unit growth is actually outperforming house growth or detached dwellings growth. Now, it's very location specific, and you need to be very careful that you don't have oversupply like there was in Melbourne kind of famously a while back. But as long as you're mitigating for those, units can be really, really awesome. And I think particularly these days, giving people a way in, because the property prices that you've mentioned in building your portfolio, it's hard to find properties that are going to perform that are at those prices these days, right? 3 properties, 1.4, you're looking sort of like somewhere between 400-500. Those are getting rarer and rarer, whereas being able to get into a unit and get more growth potentially than a detached dwelling would, that to me has been like, wow, okay, there are like a lot of different ways to skin a cat. So I think those are probably the 2 big ones. 1, you need to have a plan. Don't just go out and buy something. And 2, units can actually be a really, really good way in, especially right at the moment. It's my turn to ask you a juicy question. What do you think is the biggest thing? Because I mean, you're talking to a lot of prospects and a lot of clients that we have here at Dashdot. What's the kind of common thread that holds people back?
Good question, Emil. That's a very big question. I'd say the biggest thing that's stopping people from getting into it is just knowing, certainly having the certainty that what they're going to do is going to work out in the future. There's a lot of doom and gloom in the media, and there's a lot of just a lot of people that are basically saying property is unaffordable and questioning, should we even buy property? Is now a good time to start? Where should I buy? So while there is this doom and gloom, there's also this analysis paralysis of different opinions. So knowing who to trust is probably the biggest thing.
Okay, that's interesting. It feels like property is going to make sense, and it's going to continue making sense as the best asset class that we have in Australia. It feels like, property, I can't see anything else taking over property at the moment. And yet, because it's such a high ticket item, people that I talk to, even if they've got plenty of money and they can go and do something holds them back. And I think it is, even though it feels like it's so certain, right? You buy that property, look, it's looking fantastic. We are still human. And it is sort of like, but that's $400,000, $500,000 that I'm on the line for. What advice would you give to anyone who is kind of experiencing that, look, I'm not sure, or don't know what to do, or no, maybe not yet? What would you say?
Good question. I would say the biggest thing is getting started, and it is scary. It's going to be scary whether you do it now or you do it in 10 years' time. It's going to be scary, and it's never going to feel comfortable. It's a big step outside your comfort zone. I would say speak to someone that's already done it. Speak to someone that's in a position that you want to get into. Obviously, I'm going to say speak to the team at Dashdot. I would definitely recommend doing that. But even if it is someone that's a family member, or if it's a friend or someone that's a mutual friend, and someone that's already bought investment properties, have a chat with them and just understand what the process should be like, what you can expect. And then I would say, as hard as it is, you've got to get started at some point. You need to start.
I would add to that, particularly if you're in your 20s, as you are, if you're prepared to make a few sort of little lifestyle sacrifices. We're not talking huge ones, right? You're not having cup noodles every night for dinner and that sort of thing, right? And you do still travel. You do have a life, right?
Yeah, correct. I just got back from Europe this year, so I've traveled to Europe, Thailand, New Zealand this year. So yeah, there's definitely some good things in my life still. It's not all pain.
Okay. So particularly if you're in your early 20s or mid 20s, you're probably in terms of how the bank's looking at you, probably at the best kind of time to be able to get lending. Because if you can put together enough of a deposit, and if you've got an income, and if you can keep your costs low, then that's great. Once you start hitting 30, if you get married, then it gets even better, right? Because now you've got two incomes to build the portfolio. Once you have a child, and then maybe one of the adults in the household stops work, suddenly it can get really, really difficult at that point, because suddenly you've gone one income supporting three people from two incomes supporting two. And so I would also sort of recommend the earlier you start, the better off you're going to be. And I know some people like myself who are late starters who've managed to do it, but 47 still working. You're, from the sounds of it, by the time we play with the numbers and we imagine that you're probably going to buy a few more properties, you're not just going to sit back on the 3 as you accumulate a few more properties. You may well be. I mean, it's not unrealistic. In fact, I would say it's highly probable that you'll be retired by 33. Right? One more double cycle, which I'll predict 7 years, you'll be retired at that point, which brings up a bigger question. What's the plan for retirement? What do you want to do? You're at 33, that's it. Maybe it's 33, maybe it's a different number. What do you do?
Good question. Yeah, you're spot on. And even if we push it out to, like you said, 33, I should have about 1.7 in equity. But even if it's 35, the 2 million equity, if that is generating the 5% yield, and I'm sitting on 100K in passive income, what would I do? It's a big question. I'd probably still continue to do what I'm doing now, in the sense that I am passionate about helping people to get started in property, because I've seen how powerful it can be, not for myself, but for other people, 100%. So helping people to get started, and then also, obviously, I'm a bit of a CrossFit fanatic. So leaning into the couple of sessions a day, we've probably just dropped half the listeners have dropped off after I've said that. But yeah, continue to train a couple times a day, maybe even just get into sort of life coaching, helping people to get clear on what they want and helping them to achieve that. But otherwise, I don't think anything too much would change. I'd continue to see my family and not live too much of a crazy lifestyle. Just lean into those few things.
All right, that sounds pretty awesome. I do feel like making the smart choices when you're in your early and mid-20s, the payoff that you can get from a little bit of delayed gratification. I know so many people who are my age who didn't do that when they were younger. When the lending was there, they probably could have got into property. They could have accumulated a bunch. I know some who did that and made a few sacrifices. And now the lives that they lead is pretty awesome. You sort of have conversations with people. You can kind of work out without them saying and without asking, but you can kind of work out. I know, a decent number of people now who are sort of sitting on about 100K a year passive income. It's probably a bit more now, might be 120 to 150 passive income. They don't have to do anything for it. And the lives that they live are pretty awesome lives. And no financial stress, good health, everything like that. So if you're listening to this and you want to feel inspired, follow Frank's example, because I would say, 33, freedom, choice, and abundance, and then you get to choose how you play the game thereafter. I think that pretty much wraps everything up, Frank. Thank you so much for jumping on, sharing your journey, helping us understand some of the really, really key points and mistaken beliefs that people might have around getting credit and how to get started and why you need to get started. They're all really, really valuable points. Thank you so much. And no doubt the comment section will be flooded in with requests for more Frank, since you're a very popular member of the team. But until then, from Frank and myself, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you in the next podcast.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Emil.
Bye.